Welcome to Beyond the Next Chapter. If you are listening to this, you have made it to 2025. We are in a new year, and boy, it's so exciting to be in this spot. I have 1 year of podcasting down. We love being able to talk about books, highlighting authors, talk about really important topics to all of you. So thank you for choosing Beyond the Next Chapter in the new year. And you know what? We're going to get started off on the right foot. Today, in our first episode of the year, we're talking to the author of a new book called How to Be Enough: Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists. Dr. Ellen Hendriksen is the author. She's a clinical psychologist who's been featured in major publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Psychology Today, and many, many more. She also helped found an award-winning podcast called Savvy Psychologist. So Dr. Hendriksen is joining us today. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So How to Be Enough. I saw this book and I thought, I absolutely have to read this because, quite frankly, I oftentimes feel like I'm not enough at work, at home, with family, with friends. Tell me about the title of this book and how you decided upon this.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're in a really big boat, and I'm in that boat with you for sure. So at the Anxiety Specialty Center where I work, I would say the majority of my clients have perfectionism at the center of the overlapping Venn diagram of their challenges, but nobody ever comes in and says, you know, Ellen, I'm a perfectionist. Like, I need things to be perfect. People instead come in and say things like, I have a million things on my plate and I'm not doing any of them well. Like that sounds familiar. Or they say, I feel like I'm always failing, or I feel like I'm falling behind. I should be so much more ahead than I am in life right now. So, and I think that's because perfectionism is a little bit of a misnomer, that it's not really about striving to be perfect. It's about never feeling good enough. So that's where the impetus for the book and the title for the book came from.
Because perfectionism is one of those things people will say they're perfectionists, like they're bragging about it. Like it's like, oh, you know me, I'm a perfectionist. But ultimately, as you just mentioned, it comes down to you never feel like you're enough. So everything always has to be perfect.
It's everybody's favorite weakness. Yeah, in a job interview,
Yeah.
what's your biggest weakness? Oh, I'm such a perfectionist. But yeah, I think perfectionism is really interesting because so the most resonant definition I've seen is that it is a tendency to demand of oneself a level of performance higher than is required. Okay, so that's like a little bit of those optical illusions. You can look at one way and see one thing, or another way and see another thing, like the bunny and the duck, or the young lady and the old lady. So requiring of oneself a level of performance higher than is required can be great, right? That means we hand in stellar work. We might get a promotion out of that. It means maybe we, put a healthy and delicious dinner on the table 7 nights a week. It might mean that our social behavior is such that everybody likes us. So it can absolutely be good. Where it tips over into being unhealthy or unproductive is where that demanding of oneself a level of performance higher than is required, when we start to conflate our performance with our self-worth, when we start to, forgive my grammar, but when I do good, I am good. And when I do bad, I am bad. So that's a concept called over-evaluation, where we start to, we think we have to perform as superbly as possible to be sufficient as a person. And that's the heart of unhealthy perfectionism.
Oh, and that speaks to me, and I know speaks to so many of our listeners. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have a bad day at work and then go home feeling crummy all day, thinking I'm a bad person simply because I had one bad day at work. If someone's listening to this and they're seeing themselves, they're hearing themselves in this, what sort of is the first step here?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and then I'll add on to that. I'll make things worse by saying what happens when we do that kind of overvaluation. For sure, I do that too. Is that we start to criticize ourselves. So the two pillars of of clinical perfectionism are that overvaluation, that when we have a bad day, we think we're bad, but also we criticize ourselves in a very harsh and personalistic way. So it's like, oh, why am I so stupid? Or like, oh, why can't I get, And or it doesn't have to be name calling. It could just be this like kind of chronic dissatisfaction with our performance or how we're doing or our life in general. So okay, but so you asked what we can do about it. For the over-evaluation, what we can do is we can try to separate out ourselves from our performance. Not entirely. We're not gonna totally separate those, because of course we're proud of what we do, or of course we're bummed when things go poorly. But we want to have that not be totally overlapping concentric circles. So in the book, I tell the story of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and his time at UCLA with the legendary basketball coach John Wooden.
Mhm.
And there, the record of the team was so impressive that two researchers, this is Doctors Roland Tharp and Ronald Gallimore, sat in the stands for practices during the 1974-1975 season to see like what was the secret sauce, like what does Coach Wooden do? And they discovered that he very seldom praised or criticized his players. And instead, what he did is, as a former high school teacher, is he taught. He told you what to do and how to do it. And so he would say things like, pass from the chest, or pass the ball to someone short, run, don't walk. And so they discovered that he focused on the actions, or in our case, on the work, as opposed to on the player, on the person. And so we can take a page from this book and sort of take the stance of like a sculptor eyeing a block of marble and say, like, okay, what would make this work better? What would make this thing better? And so a way to apply that, I'll give you an example. I was working with a young conservatory student who was studying violin, and she would just mercilessly criticize herself in the practice room, like, oh, why, like, what is wrong with me? Like, this is going to be terrible. And so we tried really hard to focus on the music, on the work. And so again, we're not separating performance and self entirely, but we're not staking her self-worth on her performance. So she started saying things like, maybe I could practice this slower, or maybe I can try this with a metronome. The focus is on the work, not the self.
And that can be hard to do, but it is always a good reminder, because no one is defined. You can't define yourself solely by your work, but I'm assuming that's something a lot of your clients come in and their work is really what they find, how they define themselves in a lot of ways, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And their work is actually wonderful. It's really, really good. I like to say we look like we're hitting out of the park, but we feel like we're striking out. And I think what happens is that, I certainly recognize this in myself too, is sometimes we will see every work opportunity or project as sort of a test, like as a referendum on ourselves. And then if we do well, like, okay, phew, it's okay. Like nobody's going to hate me, or I haven't failed. But if we do not reach our high and personally demanding standards, then that's where that over-evaluation comes in, and we feel like we've failed. So I think one is we can absolutely just start to separate work and self a little bit, but we can also see our work in context, that not every single project has to be this referendum, has to be this test that we have to pass, that we can see the larger picture and see that we have done a lot of good things, and that having a couple of diggers or a couple of stinkers is just going to be part of the package deal. I like to say, it's not the high standards that are the problem. Please keep your high standards. That's what makes the world go round. But we can instead build in some room for inevitable mistakes, just because we are human and alive and here in 2025. So don't lower your standards. Keep your high standards, but make some room for inevitable mistakes.
I love in the book, you sort of open the book by talking about two very famous men who were perfectionists and had very different styles in which they led. I'm talking about Walt Disney and Fred Rogers. Kind of talk a little bit about them and the differences between those two.
Yeah, this was really fascinating to research and write, because both, Disney and Rogers' creations are beloved, are immortal. I grew up with both of their work, but they had really similar personalities. They both had really high standards, really strong work ethic. They were both pretty intense. They focused intently on the details, but they really lived those values really differently. And so let me give you an example around fear of mistakes. We just started talking about mistakes. So in the book, I tell a story of Mr. Rogers changing out of his blazer into his cardigan at the beginning of his show, the signature. And he realized when buttoning up his sweater that he was one button off. And so the crew, knowing his high standards, expected him to call cut and start over. But instead, he just acknowledged the mistake on camera and turned it on the fly into a lesson about how mistakes happen and they can be corrected. Whereas with Walt Disney, I tell the story there of his micromanagement of the making of Snow White. So first full-length animated feature. And he just cannot bring himself to trust this world-class team of artists that he's hired. He makes them redo tiny details like, oh, the queen's eyebrows are too extreme. Grumpy's finger is too big. The hummingbird, you should make 6 pickups instead of 4. And at the premiere, he tells a reporter, I wish I could just go back and yank this whole thing back and start over again. Both of them had, again, similar perfectionistic personalities, but Walt Disney was kind of rigidly focused on avoiding mistakes, whereas Fred Rogers kind of seamlessly folded mistakes into his high standards.
What can we do if we see ourselves in that Walt Disney? If you're afraid of making mistakes, how can we become a little bit more like Mr. Rogers?
Sure. Yeah, I think, the perfectionism has also been defined as a form of overcompensation. And if we see ourselves, we see a little bit of perfectionism in ourselves, we might over prepare or show up overdressed or be overly friendly or over research. And then what happens is that over preparation, going beyond, gets the credit. That steals the credit for us not making a mistake or being shunted from all to nothing. And so what we can do is in lower stakes scenarios, rather than over preparing, simply prepare. Rather than being overly friendly, simply be friendly. Again, we're not doing a 180. We're not going to say oh, I'm going to wing it, or I'm going to show up in sweatpants, or I'm going to be rude to people. We're absolutely not doing that. We're keeping our high standards, but we can try to just roll back the overcompensation so it doesn't get the credit. And then we can see, one, maybe there was nothing to compensate for to begin with. Maybe we were okay just as we were. And then also that overwork doesn't steal the credit for us being sufficient. Anyway, yeah.
Burnout is a word we hear a lot these days. You mention it, you talk about it in the book. It's just something that's become quite common as so many of us are really burned out by just all of our responsibilities. How does perfectionism lead to burnout?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I talk about my own episode of burnout, in the book. For me, it was mostly physical. A few years ago, woke up unable to turn my head to the right because my muscles were so tight. I went through 5 rounds of physical therapy. I ended up with a GI illness. So, I'm right there with you, or with your listeners who might relate. So yeah, perfectionism can absolutely lead to burnout, because if we think we have to hit it out of the park every time, again, to be sufficient as a person, we set the bar for adequate at flawless. And then that takes so much energy and time to reach that bar. But it makes sense if we think that our self-worth is at stake. We're not going to back down. But over time, it can definitely lead to work-life problems. In my case, physical strain. I'll see a lot of clients come into the clinic with their marriage on the rocks. They realize they've had their nose to the grindstone for so long that all their friends have drifted away. So it's absolutely a 2025 problem. And it makes sense, honestly, because every human reacts to the situations we're put in. And so when we're put in a highly demanding, ratings-driven, optimization-focused society, then it makes total sense that we're going to respond with some perfectionism. So perfectionism can come from within, for sure, but it also comes from all around us, which can be hard to fight. But once you start to see it, it becomes easier to sort of push against.
And you talk about the different types of perfectionism in your book, specifically the type that comes from social media, that comes from the outside world, that's affecting teens in a very different way than it has in the past.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are three kinds of perfectionism. So we've mostly been talking about what's called self-oriented perfectionism, which is sort of the classic form of perfectionism when we're hard on ourselves. Then there's also what's called other-oriented perfectionism, which is when we might be hard on the people around us, be very demanding of them. And ironically, it's usually the people closest to us, like our partner, our kids, our employees, the people we think reflect on us. And then what you're referring to is the third kind of perfectionism, socially prescribed perfectionism. And that is assuming others will be hard on us. We assume that others are going to be judgy and critical and demanding of us. And so we work really, really hard to try to reach an imagined standard that others have for us. And that is the one that is increasing exponentially. So this is the work of Doctors Thomas Kern and Andrew Hill, and they looked at 27 years of data and found that the inflection point for when socially prescribed perfectionism started to skyrocket was 2005. And I think correlation doesn't mean causation, but I think it's no coincidence that that's when Facebook came out.
Yeah, when I was a teen, we had MySpace, and then it was like Facebook came out, but it was only if you were in college. I can't imagine being a teenager and having Instagram and TikTok. I mean, it just adds a whole nother very complex level of growing up when you're seeing everybody else growing up at the same time.
Right, because social media is the highlight reel. Nobody posts the bad stuff. It's both overt and subtle. I was talking to another podcast host, and she said that through Pinterest or Instagram, that she sort of internalized this idea that she had to have a beautiful home, even though she had two toddlers. And so she had this idea like, oh, I've got to have this beautiful white and beige house. And then she just felt this giant weight come off her shoulders when she had this epiphany and realized that's not even what I want. I want a climbing wall in my living room. I want to have my toddler's toys everywhere. And so it can be really hard to see the standards all around us and to resist and feel like we don't have to meet those. Instead, we can follow our own values and what we really want, as opposed to doing this generic right thing.
I love that. Your house should look how you want and make sense for you and your family, but it can be so hard to just, you get bogged down by everything that you see on the internet. And as you just mentioned, you dealt with burnout yourself. What are some things that helped you deal with burnout? Because I mean, a 3-month break from work sounds lovely, but unfortunately, it might not be realistic for any of us.
Right. Must be nice, huh? Yeah, no, I could not do that either. Something that was really helpful for me was, okay, so I take the subtitle of my book really seriously. It's Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists. And that implies that you don't have to do anything differently. It's like self-acceptance. And so I know that my brain is just wired to be a little more self-critical, that just like some brains are wired to be optimistic or pessimistic, wired to be introverted or extroverted, my brain and a lot of other people's brains are wired to be hard on ourselves. But I have learned to listen to to treat my self-criticisms sort of like the music at a coffee shop. Like it's there, I can hear it, but I don't have to take it so seriously and so literally. Like the heart of perfectionism is actually really healthy. It's a personality trait called conscientiousness. And that is a tendency to do things well and thoroughly, to be responsible, to be dutiful. I call it the world's least sexy superpower, but it is really the one to choose, for a good life, both objectively and subjectively, research has shown us. So my conscientious brain, because I take things, seriously, takes my thoughts and my feelings a little too seriously sometimes. And so getting that healthy perspective and learning to say like, oh, that's what my brain does. Oh, these are those thoughts again, is really helpful to be able to not make them have to go away, because that's going to be like trying to push a beach ball underwater. It's just going to rebound. But to just see them go by, like sushi at a revolving restaurant, or like the music at the grocery store.
All of your thoughts are not fact. I literally think I saw that on a bumper sticker somewhere, and that is incredibly helpful.
Yes, don't believe everything you think, for sure.
Yeah, that's what it was. That's what it was. I couldn't think of the right phrase. Definitely.
You got the essence. Yes.
Yes, I got the general vibe. And that really is, as soon as I try to start thinking that myself sometimes, and as soon as you get that it sounds so simple, but that piece of advice really is so helpful, and I loved that part of your book. The other part I liked of your book, there was a quote in there where it said something like, dare to be unproductive. Tell me a little bit about why it's so important for us to just do things just because we like to do them, not because they're on a to-do list, not because somebody on the internet told us we need to have our house look a certain way.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No. So again, the heart of perfectionism is conscientiousness, which is great. Like, please keep that. That's going to get you far. And it means that often we subscribe to rules or ideas like always be productive or always be learning or always be improving. And like part of that is true, but sometimes again we can take that a little too literally. And so I often will work with clients who in their free time think, okay, I have to be productive. So if I'm going to sit in front of Netflix, I should watch a documentary. Or if I'm going to read a book, like I should read like a history of the Middle East. And that's absolutely, if you want to do that, if that brings you joy, please do that. But I think what happens is we can put too many eggs in the basket of performance, the basket of improvement, and we forget to put eggs in the basket of connection or enjoyment. And so it is not only totally okay, but probably good for us, even though we could think of that as being productive too, to read a rom-com, to watch a gross out comedy, to just spend time being stupid with your friends. Like those things are not a waste of time or not unproductive. It's the yin to the yang of productivity, and we need both to live a good life.
Mm-hmm. If somebody's listening to this and they're identifying with some part of our conversation, what other advice would you have for someone who's a perfectionist, whether it's on themselves, whether it's for others, if they fit any of these sort of, I guess, labels?
Sure. Yeah, I think something that was helpful for me was, okay, so I hear the word self-compassion a lot. That's something that gets thrown around a lot. And I when I learned about self-compassion, it was described to me as talking to yourself as you would to a good friend. But my perfectionistic brain then thought that I had to like feed myself like articulate paragraphs of self-compassionate hype. That was way too high a bar. And so it was very helpful for me to learn that self-compassion doesn't even have to be words. It doesn't have to be talking to yourself at all. It can be actions. So self-compassion can be giving yourself time to drink your coffee in the morning. It can be taking a few minutes to stand under the warm shower on a cold morning. It can be, it can be making yourself go to the gym because you know that you will feel better afterwards. But it could also be giving yourself permission to skip the gym because you're already exhausted and what you really need is another hour of sleep. Mm-hmm. So self-compassion, again, doesn't have to be like self-compassion speech writing. It can be actions, taking care of yourself, treating yourself as someone who deserves to be taken care of. And it can be inactions. It can be giving yourself permission not to do everything you expect of yourself.
Is there anything else you want to add that I haven't asked that you think is really important? Any other really big takeaways from the book that you're hoping readers will walk away with?
Yeah, I guess the last thing is, so, okay, I'll tell you a little story. I had a potential client email me and say that she wanted to work on perfectionism. I said, cool, yeah, come on in. We scheduled a first appointment. And the morning of that first appointment, she emailed me again and said, Ellen, I've been reflecting and I would like to wait until I have the energy and the time and the bandwidth to work really hard on this. And so she had this idea that tackling perfectionism and making room for connection and enjoyment in her life was going to be hard and arduous. And so I really want to send the message that it, just like with my self-criticism example, you don't have to do anything really differently at all. That we can just approach our brains or our actions or the world, with a slightly different mindset, and that even just treating ourselves with 5% more kindness, with 10% more understanding is likely enough. It doesn't have to be a 180. It doesn't have to be a gut renovation.
And I really like that in your book, and you make that really clear. And with a lot of your clients who they're still sort of the same person, they're just
Mm.
sort of using what you'd said earlier, and just because you think something doesn't necessarily mean it's true, and just kind of let it fly by in your brain like a cloud in the sky.
Yeah, I mean, and they're still conscientious. I might say they're still perfectionistic. Again, if we go back to that definition we started with of demanding of oneself a level of performance higher than is required, they still do that. But they, and I like to think I have tried to kind of unravel that over evaluation to try to make some room for the inevitable blips and bloops of life, and to be more self-compassionate and self-forgiving.
Great, Dr. Hendrickson, thank you so much. How to Be Enough, Self-Acceptance for Self-Critics and Perfectionists. It's out now. Is there an audiobook version of this as well?
There he is, for sure.
Okay.
If you want to listen, you can do that.
Okay, perfect. Love it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. That was great. You asked really good questions.